Ed's going to speak for about 30 minutes-ish, and then we'll take questions. Ed, over to you.
Well, thanks, Mike, and good afternoon. So today I want to talk about how geopolitics will impose itself on the business environment in 2021 and beyond as we gradually emerge from the pandemic. There was a time before the financial crisis of 2008 to 9 when the world seemed fairly predictable. Geopolitics provided a reasonably stable platform for business to get on with its job of satisfying its customers and making money unmolested. But since then, one thing after another has left the world reeling. That means geopolitics today is highly uncertain, and it leaves me in an odd position. For I think that confident predictions about how geopolitics will change are less reliable than ever. Yet at the same time, I believe it's also more important than at any point in my lifetime for business people to keep a close eye on the world around them. So, with the warning that today I won't be accepting any of your bets about my predictions, however tempting the odds, let me get going. Today I'll focus on three areas, and I like to think of them as a set of nested spheres. At the heart is the relationship between China and America, which is clearly the driving force in international affairs today. If America and China find an accommodation, the world will head in one direction. If they become ensnared in a systemic, all-encompassing rivalry, it'll head in quite another. How will the relationship develop, and what will that mean for the rest of us? The next sphere is the European Union. It is a commercial superpower, which means it's a huge market and important regulator. But it is also a strategic minnow. It has less autonomy than America or China, but along with India, it could end up playing a key role. Does it have the clarity of purpose and coherence to do so? And, for the purposes of this talk at least, the outer sphere is Britain. After Brexit, the UK has nimbleness and freedom of action on its side, but it's also lacking in economic and military heft. How can it best use its strengths to make the world congenial for its interests, including its businesses? And the context for all of this, of course, is the pandemic. So let me start there. I spent a fair amount of my time at The Economist on the epidemiology of COVID-19 and the prospects and effects of vaccination. I don't propose to focus on that today, but we can talk about it in the Q&A afterwards, if any of you choose. And I've also set out a series of articles that contain data and charts, if you want to go into more depth on the thing I'm about to speak. Instead, I want to focus on the pandemic's legacy. Now, one comparison is with the Spanish flu, which struck between 1918 and 1920 and killed perhaps 50 million people, and 6 times as many Americans as died in the trenches. When Warren Harding stood for the US presidency in the 1920 election, he campaigned on the theme of a return to what he was the first to call normalcy, the idea that people just wanted to get back to the life they had. Harding won the election, becoming the 29th president of the United States, and yet the Roaring Twenties and the Jazz Age showed just how wrong he was. To understand why we won't be going back to normal when lockdowns are lifted, I think it's helpful to consider an old piece of Jewish wisdom. So there was an old lady in the shtetl who was unhappy because her house was too cramped, and she went to complain to the rabbi, and he told her to bring her goat into the room to live with her. She asked him whatever he was thinking about, but he asked her to try it and see. Well, of course, her room was even more crowded and uncomfortable, so she went back to the rabbi, and he told her to bring in her chickens. That was even worse, because the chickens roosted on her furniture. But when she went to him a third time, he told her to bring in her cow. Well, she tried that, and life really did become impossible. So she went to have it out with him, and the rabbi told her to put all her animals back out into the farmyard. That afternoon, he came to visit the woman, and he asked her how her house was now. "Wonderful, Rabbi," she replied. "I feel so free. There's so much room." I think COVID-19 lockdowns are a bit like that. When we regain what was once normal, it will seem liberating. Having been cooped up, I think people will realise that life isn't for hoarding, but for living. Our appetite for risk will increase. Having seen what technology can do, we'll want to embrace its possibilities. Having seen injustices that we chose to overlook, we'll want to put some of them right. Where life seemed cramped and hemmed in, we will feel freer. I don't think we'll see this sort of energy right away. The abatement of the pandemic will be gradual. There'll be setbacks and irritations. The removal of government support will result in bankruptcies and hardship. But I'm optimistic that within the next few years, the 2020s will roar just as the 1920s did. In fact, in lots of ways, the pandemic will act as an accelerator, speeding up and intensifying changes that were already in the making. And the relationship between China and America is a good illustration of that. So let us turn to that. The outstanding achievement of Donald Trump's foreign policy was to recast the American approach to China. To generalize, before he burst onto the scene, there was a growing sense of alarm in Washington about China's rise and its increasing assertiveness. For example, look at the way it was bullying Japan over the contested Senkaku Islands, or Diaoyu as the China calls them, or its occupation and development of various reefs and shoals in the South China Sea. But under the Obama administration, this alarm had been tempered by a sense that the US needed China's help in everything from arms control to climate change, and a belief more generally that as China became richer, it would gradually become more liberal. But then Xi Jinping took charge, and he quickly centralized power and control and re-established the party's grip on an ideological orthodoxy that clearly led in precisely the opposite direction. That culminated in his changing the rules to enable him to remain in power after the end of his second term in 2022. Trump didn't exactly change minds in Washington. They were changing already, but he did galvanize the shift to a more realist and combative relationship. And whatever else you might think about the Trump presidency, that was genuinely consequential. At first, Trump was focused on trade, and in particular, the bilateral trade deficit. That was electorally effective. No matter that economists sneered, and rightly so, because bilateral trade deficits are neither here nor there, there was a powerful reception on the left and the right that China had taken American jobs. At the same time, the national security establishment was becoming increasingly alarmed at the strength of the Chinese armed forces and over moves like the clampdown on Hong Kong. Trump has a genius for stirring up conflict, and sure enough, what began as a trade dispute has gradually turned into something far bigger. The Phase 1 trade deal between the two superpowers caused a lot of fanfare, but it was really just a skinny mercantilist plan for China to buy more from the US. It hasn't produced the results, yielding just 3/5 of the gains that had been agreed on, according to a recent analysis. It didn't get to grips with the underlying problems in the relationship, which include state aid, intellectual property theft, and let's be honest, the growing sense that China is a strategic rival to the US. During the rest of the Trump presidency, the dispute has spread from one area to another. Think of Huawei and a US campaign to stop other countries from buying its equipment, a campaign that met with real success here in London. Or think of the pressure put on American universities to vet Chinese students, especially postgrads in the sciences, and to dig into the backgrounds of academics of Chinese origin. When the pandemic struck, it sent everything into overdrive. Again, politics was the proximate cause. There are genuine questions about China's behaviour in the pandemic. Though it released a sequence of the viral genome very early, it has also obstructed inquiries into the origins of the pathogen. But Trump wanted a scapegoat to deflect the blame for the administration's slow response to the disease, and so his insistence on calling it the China virus and Kung flu. The irony won't be lost on medical historians. The so-called Spanish flu, only has that name because Spanish newspapers weren't censored and therefore reported early cases that other combatants in World War I suppressed, lest it demoralise people. The actual origin of Spanish flu was probably Kansas, and it was brought over by American troops who fought in France. At the same time as COVID-19 has fired up Trump's hostility to China, China itself has looked on aghast. Our Beijing bureau reports how its people are genuinely shocked at how badly the West has coped with the disease. And of course, they're told by their government that it's all the fault of chaotic and decadent Western democracy. That has strengthened the voices of those Chinese policymakers who think now is the time to press against Western constraints, even as their rivals inside China continue to counsel patience. In sum, the situation Biden inherited just under a week ago, in which a trade dispute had become a broad struggle for supremacy over technology and soft, hard power. Relations are at their worst since Nixon went to China almost 50 years ago. Where will they go from here? Well, I think of it like this. Trump made it clear that China has a problem for the United States. It's Biden's task to find the solution. And here reality imposes itself, because America is least likely to prevail against China if it continues on its own. This is partly because the Chinese economy is so big and growing bigger all the time, but it's also a consequence of how this second Cold War differs from the first. The rivalry with the Soviet Union was focused on ideology and nuclear weapons. The new battlefield today is information technology, semiconductors, data, 5G mobile networks, internet standards, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. Information technology is not just central to a country's strengths in military and in intelligence. They're also the enabling technologies that will play a big part in determining how dynamic its economy will be, and hence a measure of its influence. And they could even give one of the rivals an advantage in scientific research, a key source of future productivity growth. Think of, say, how DeepMind has transformed synthetic biology by using artificial intelligence to work out how proteins fold, which could be the secret to working out how cells function, as well as all sorts of new drugs. The role of technology explains why America cannot go it alone. The first Cold War created separate looking-glass worlds. The protagonists in the second Cold War are interconnected. That stems from the network efficiencies of many tech businesses, which reward size and spread. It reflects how hard it is for any one country to master the full range of specialisms in the tech economy. In chips, say, American or British designs may be made in Taiwanese plants using Japanese and Dutch equipment with German lenses before being assembled in Chinese factories. It's no accident that autarkic North Korea can build the key machinery of the first Cold War, nuclear weapons, but not the advanced computers that are the key machinery of the second one. In short, I think Trump's gut instinct for America to go it alone was probably doomed. To have the best chance of holding its own against China, America needs to work with its allies. And here Biden's instinct could hardly be more at odds with Trump's. After years in the Senate, having served for a long time on the Foreign Relations Committee and as vice president, he's steeped in the post-war conception of America's role as head of a global alliance. And he understands how its soft power is derived from standing up for democracy and freedom. And that is why trade will continue to play an important part in this policy. And let me set out 3 reasons. The first is the pandemic, which revealed that some countries' supply chains of essential goods, including personal protective equipment and the precursors to drugs, are beyond the control of the United States. The administration will want to be sure that it can guarantee secure supplies in future, should there be another emergency. Companies, as you know, are also looking to make their supply chains more robust. I don't think that means repatriating them so much as making sure that there is a diversity of suppliers and that no company is vulnerable to a chokehold. The second reason why trade will remain central is that the Biden administration see it as a useful tool for negotiating with China, and to back down in any significant way without getting something big in exchange would be taken as weakness. And the third reason goes back to that point about strategic value of information technology. Once more, take the chip industry, for example. As we described in our issue last week, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation has become an essential part of America's IT industry. Along with Samsung of South Korea, it has the world's most advanced chip-making processes. Intel, meanwhile, which did so much to create the chip industry, has started to fall behind. While TSMC is set to make chips with details of just 3 nanometers, Intel is stuck at 7 nanometers, which it has said it will not be able to make until next year. America and the rest of the West will want a trade regime that enables it to guarantee supplies and which attempts to stop China from catching up. And given Taiwan's strategic vulnerability and the non-negotiable claim that Beijing has on what it sees as a rebel province, that creates a tinderbox. I therefore expect to see a trade environment that is far more managed. We could see a battle between China and its allies to establish international standards, and not just in technical bodies, but also in foreign policy more broadly. For example, it's striking that Chinese diplomats now head up 4 of the UN's 15 specialized agencies, and America just 1. Last year, China narrowly lost a contest to become head of the World Intellectual Property Organization after a campaign by the US ensured that the job went to a Singaporean. It's hard to overstate what is at stake in all this. It's not just a question of what happens in the West, but of norms elsewhere around the world. Will China's approach to facial recognition become what you should expect when you catch a plane to Indonesia or South Africa? As the internet becomes the splinter net, which countries will line up on which side? Will the West have the critical mass to remain ahead in the really crucial technologies like semiconductor making, AI, and quantum computing? Many of those questions could be determined within the next decade. To sum up then, the defining geopolitical question of our age is how America handles the rise of China and how tempted China is to challenge America. Donald Trump put that question at the center of US foreign policy, for which he deserves credit. But he didn't have a solution, if only because his policy was for America to struggle alone, and America's neither big enough nor dominant in all the requisite technologies. The role of finding a solution will now fall to Biden. If he is to choreograph a robust response to the expansion of Chinese influence and power, he will need to renew his ties with allies. Trade will be an important part of that. And that leads me to the second of my concentric spheres, the European Union. You might have heard about the recent commercial pact between China and the European Union. I'm all for deals that expand trade. Unfortunately, this one only goes to show how hard it will be for Biden's America to work with Europe over China. The negotiating mandate for the deal dates back to 2013, which in the history of China relations, as I said earlier, is a bygone age, when there was a common assumption that ideological differences between the West and China would gradually melt away, or at least become less important. However, seen in the light of the new US-China rivalry, the EU-China deal is a very worrying sign, for 2 reasons. Let me explain why. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, claimed that the deal promoted the EU's core values, but it ignores Europe's dependence on Chinese supply chains and fails to deal with the forced labour by the Uyghur people, a Muslim minority in Xinjiang, a big far western province of China. You'll have seen in the news, perhaps, how 1 million Uyghurs have been interned for nothing more than having a beard or visiting the mosque. One of the last acts of the Trump administration was to accuse China of genocide, and the Biden administration seems to agree with that judgment. In the deal with the EU, however, China promises just to do its best on rights in general terms, and that's worth very little. The Europeans could have waited until the Biden administration was in office so as to be able to negotiate jointly, or at least to coordinate their positions. That's what Biden's people wanted, but they went ahead anyway. China, naturally, sees this snub before Biden even took office as a significant victory. To the new administration, it is a slap in the face. If Biden wants to rally the democratic world behind his China alliance, he's got off to a very poor start indeed. The pity here is that the European Union has a strategic vision and that it's ultimately not well served by the new pact with China. Before COVID-19 struck, one of the centerpieces of Ms von der Leyen's plan for the presidency was to make Europe an important strategic actor with real influence in the way the world works. And don't forget Emmanuel Macron, France's president. He is acutely aware of how the world is breaking into blocks. He thinks that the EU's members on their own are too small to fight their corner. He wants the EU as a whole to come together to forge a role that is fitting for its history, and that if it fails, Europe will become an irrelevance. Now, there are some things going for Macron's dream. The EU is a very, very big market of 450 million people. That means it is a commercial superpower. Ironically, because its tech companies are rather weak, that gives a lot of influence in how tech is regulated. At the moment, it's grappling with how to tax digital trade and threatening the United States to impose unilateral rules. At the same time, the top European court has rejected American data protection rules as being inadequate for data that's coming from the EU because it may be picked over by America's intelligence agencies. At The Economist, we've argued that there may be the makings of a grand bargain here. America would listen to European concerns about tax, privacy, and takeovers, and Europe would sign up to the American security agenda on China. The Transatlantic Alliance is in better shape than some people think. After all, more American soldiers were stationed in Europe at the end of the Trump presidency than at the end of the Obama presidency. China is inadvertently managing to drive together countries such as the Czech Republic, which finds themselves on the receiving end of its wolf warrior diplomacy over Taiwan. That said, however, we are under no illusions about how hard a grand bargain would be to pull off. One obstacle is that for Macron in particular, following America's lead is not what he had in mind when he talked of Europe's strategic autonomy. When we interviewed him in 2019, he talked about NATO being brain dead. With the departure of Angela Merkel as the German Chancellor later this year, Macron will become its most influential global statesman. Another difficulty is that America under Trump has lost credibility in Europe. Even though Biden has a completely different style, European leaders will not conclude that Trump was a one-off in America until they've seen a few presidents come and go without Trumpism once again rearing its head. It's a sentiment Angela Merkel has put most forcefully. We grew up in the certain knowledge that the United States wanted to be a world power, she said. Should the US now wish to withdraw from that role of its own free will, we would have to reflect on that very deeply. Now that might sound moderate, but in Merkel speak, it was a real carpeting. A third is that Europe finds it very hard to act together. The EU worked in concert impressively over Brexit, but on other foreign policy goals, its members really struggled to speak with one voice and to react fast. Just look at how early this month Hungary broke with the EU to buy a Chinese vaccine for its COVID-19 programme. In principle, the EU's fragmentation is one more reason for thinking that the EU cannot be an independent force in foreign policy, and that to begin to make its weight felt, it needs to be the help of an external, galvanizing influence like the United States. In practice, however, even working with the US becomes very hard to coordinate. And a fourth obstacle to Europe working with the US is protectionism. Europe is worried about the takeover of its companies, its struggles in the tech industries. There are lots of reasons for this, and they're well rehearsed, but the most ironic is that Europe's single market is still too fragmented to allow tech firms to blitzscale. In its individual silos, they cannot grow fast enough to benefit from the network effects they need to become world-class. As a result, many of them end up being eclipsed or bought. The danger that the pursuit of strategic autonomy will only make protectionism worse. Remember how the French government decided that national security meant they had to protect Danone, which makes yogurt? Well, in the past few weeks, Couche-Tard, the Canadian retailer, has dropped its bid for Carrefour after the French government made it known that they were against the deal because it supposedly threatened food security and jobs. So, this is where we stand. The nature of competition between America and China means that America needs allies even more than it did in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. The European Union is an essential ally, but rather than wait for Biden to take office, as his staff had urged, it has rushed ahead to demonstrate its strategic autonomy by signing a commercial deal with China, to China's delight and the Biden people's dismay. It was an ill omen, not fatal to their working together, but hardly conducive either. And that leads to my outermost circle, Britain. Enthusiasts think that post-Brexit Britain can be more agile. Nimble moves have shown how Britain can stand out. It offered people in Hong Kong a path to British citizenship after China's crackdown there. It imposed sanctions on Belarus while the rest of Europe dithered. Its regulator rapidly approved a COVID vaccine. Over the coming year, Britain has an opportunity for a different sort of prominence, thanks to its hosting in November, along with Italy, of the COP26 climate conference, and its chairmanship of the G7 club of big, rich democracies. Boris Johnson's invited Australia, India and South Korea to the G7 summit. Whether or not this develops into a D10 of democracies, Britain likes the idea of working with smaller groups of like-minded countries. With Canada, for example, it's championing a campaign to defend media freedom. Within Europe, it's keen on the E3, alongside France and Germany, which despite COVID-19 met 5 times in 2020 to discuss Iran and more. The British are cultivating partners in Asia too. As we meet virtually today, Johnson was to have been in India as guest of honour at the country's Republic Day, but COVID-19 got in the way. He's spoken of a quantum leap in bilateral relations. The visit is part of a tilt to the Indo-Pacific, reflecting the region's importance for trade, supply chains, climate change and security. Britain plans to send an aircraft carrier to Asia in the coming year. It's opened discussions with the 11 countries of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, with a view to joining the free trade area. It wants to become a dialogue partner of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, as the EU already is. Though far behind America and China, Britain remains a significant power, holding one of the 5 permanent seats on the UN Security Council. It's a muscular member of NATO, with a capable military force, including nuclear weapons. GCHQ, Britain's Signals Intelligence Service, makes it a potent part of Five Eyes intelligence sharing elite, together with America, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. Thanks to the remnants of empire, Britain is one of the few countries to have overseas territories around the world, giving it far-flung islands such as the Falklands and strategically placed bases such as Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, leased to America, as well as tax havens like Bermuda and the Cayman Islands. In London, it has one of the great global cities and financial centres, and Britain is an aid superpower, a rare rich country committed to spending a big chunk of its national income on international development. Britain's soft power extends to the BBC, to top universities, globe-spinning charities. In health, it's the biggest contributor to Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, and the biggest voluntary contributor to the World Health Organization. The government may have botched the response to COVID-19, but its scientists have excelled themselves. They've helped to develop what may prove to be the most widely used vaccine, the one from Oxford AstraZeneca, and to identify the most effective treatment, the steroid dexamethasone. The country's climate scientists are also top-notch, and its carbon-cutting record is exemplary. But there are 2 big buts, and they are big. The first, to the extent that a country's weight in the world depends on that of its economy. Britain's long-term decline is clear. It may also be accelerating. The drop in GDP in 2020 was steeper in Britain, nearly 10% estimates the IMF, than in most European countries. The average for Europe as a whole was 7.2%. Since 2005, Britain's share of the world market cap has fallen from 7% to 3%, a much greater slippage than any other large European economy. Over the same period, British headquartered multinational share of the stock of global cross-border investment has fallen from 10% to 6%, also a bigger drop than for any other major economy. Such trends dent the swashbuckling pretensions of global Britain. The second but is that the UK might break apart, with independence for Scotland and a blow not only to its standing in the world, but huge problems for the nuclear fleet and the basing of fighter planes to intercept Russian incursions. The challenge then for Britain is both economic and strategic. The economic problem just got harder. The government's own estimate is that Brexit will leave the economy 4% smaller than it would otherwise have been, because the single market will be less accessible, there'll be fewer economies of scale and less competition. The government cannot seem to make up its mind. Sometimes it embraces an agenda to turn the country into Singapore-on-Thames, and yet on others, in truth, when it comes to the detail, it shies away from deregulation that is expected to harm or offend important interests. For instance, on farming, it has both spoken of doing a trade deal with the United States as soon as it can, but also of not lowering food hygiene or animal welfare standards. Eventually, it will have to choose. The cabinet contains plenty of Singaporers. I would welcome a certain amount of deregulation, as I suspect many here would. But I'm not sure the great British public would. The Brexit vote was a compact between those who felt that Brussels was socialist and over-regulated, and those who thought that it was an offence to Britain's sovereignty by forcing upon the country too much immigration and competition. Britons would like to think of themselves as champions of free enterprise, but remember the 1970s when a third of the labour force worked in the public sector. In fact, there were so many benefits that the Department of Health and Social Security produced a leaflet that listed all the other leaflets. So where does that leave us? I'd like to finish by drawing three conclusions. The first is to expect enormous change in the 2020s. Not only does the pandemic favour this, but so too does the delicate geopolitical balance between America and the United States. A new order will emerge. Its nature remains unclear, but I believe the decade we have just entered will do much to determine it. The second is that we need to watch whether Europe faces up to its strategic weaknesses. The paradox is that it has real cards to play, but by overreaching, as it did with the China-EU commercial pact, it could end up squandering them by driving a wedge between itself and America. And the third pertains to Britain. Again, the first step, if Britain is to realise its potential, is for us to be honest about its strengths and weaknesses, something we've not always been good at. Global Britain is a great slogan, but it contains the seeds of an attempt to do a bit of everything, and hence of doing nothing at all very well. We must choose too. So let me finish by quoting Lenin, not a habit of mine, I assure you, but he once said that there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. That sort of change will be a feature of our time. Buckle up. I'm optimistic about plenty. I mean, I think if you look back to the Roaring Twenties, it was a time of social and technological change, very forward-looking in lots of ways. Of course, there were the seeds of terrible problems in the 1930s and the seeds of the Depression, but it was also a time when people shed their inhibitions. So I'm optimistic about that. I also think that, if a really important test of the next year or so is how the world comes together to deal with vaccines. If it's every country for itself, if government is seen to fail, so in other words, if the problems we've seen in continental Europe endure and Europe starts preventing exports getting out and that sort of thing, if that happens and the world seems to splinter, then it will have failed a really important test of global governance, and other problems like arms control and climate change will be all the harder to deal with. But if the world comes together through initiatives like COVAX, in which you both kind of pool the purchasing and distribution of vaccines, and vaccination is seen to be successful and a sort of global enterprise, then I think it furthers those things like climate change and arms control. So there's a real prize to be had, not just sort of health for the economy, but also the kind of indication that the world can work together for the good of everybody. Oh, 1 to 10. I mean, I think it was a 4 myself. So on Brexit, it probably won't surprise you to know that we were against Brexit, and I can go into the reasons for that. Essentially, they're economic and strategic. But there is a deeper logic behind Brexit, which is that by the time the referendum became an inevitability, I think there was real dissatisfaction in Britain that needed to be represented in the democracy. I mean, for the health of the democracy. It was clear, I think, to an extent that I confess I certainly hadn't realised, that there was great resentment of London, particularly, and of people like me, and that it was perceived that a kind of smaller and smaller coterie of elites were capturing all the benefits for the country. And, that was a very dangerous course. And the fact that something I think bad came out of it, I regret that. But it was really important that we changed course, I think. There was something wrong. I'm a liberal in a classically liberal sense, and I believe in competition in society. And I think a kind of group of people were kind of capturing all the good things in society, and a lot of people were being left behind, and that had to change. The long-term effects of the pandemic. I mean, one of the exciting things about the pandemic is that it's brought about changes that I think just wouldn't have happened otherwise. We have discovered that actually people can work from home, that bureaucratic structures can be looser than they were, that innovations can happen, that we can cope with them. So I think that's very welcome. At the same time, however, I think it's introduced a dependency on the state and a sense that the state is there to protect people that has kind of shifted kind of margins. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how, coming out of that, to what extent the state has to start picking up risk again. I mean, one of the really interesting things after Thatcher was that risk was shed from the state back onto the individual. Well, the pandemic's been a moment where the state has picked up lots of risk again. And will it stay with the state, or will it kind of go back to individuals? And I really don't know. I've got a feeling that it will revert somewhat, and that the citizens will want the state to take on more risk. And that's a challenge that I don't think the state is terribly well equipped for at the moment. I think it's really, really important. It's just raised up our agenda. And you can see from the appointments that Biden has made, putting Kerry, who's a really sort of big Washington beast, in this kind of important role in his cabinet for overseeing climate change, shows you that it's going to be a very important part of the Biden administration too. In fact, one of their infrastructure plans is really to make it sort of green American industry, both as a source of jobs, but also as a way of cutting down climate emissions. So it's going to be really important. It's one of the things that complicates enormously the relationship with China, because America, whilst trying to sort of stop China becoming more of a threat, needs to work with it in order to get climate change to function. So I think almost every area of policy, in one way or another, climate is going to start to become one of those things that you factor in. Again, COVID is a really good test of this. In South Africa, my correspondent there, reports how, here's a country that's both tested Western vaccine. I think it was the AstraZeneca vaccine, but anyway, it tested Western vaccines, and it's got a plant to make the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. If that's approved, they've got results coming out, I think, by the end of the month. So it's sort of been involved in this, but yet it feels as if it's not getting supplies. that's a real opportunity for China and Russia to come in and start to show that the West isn't dependable. In more general terms, I think China's sort of love affair with Africa has cooled somewhat, and it's become clear that there are strings attached. So I think there's a sort of real contest there, but it's an indication, I guess, of one of the kind of important trends in the decade, which is that in spite of China's rhetoric of staying at home and of not being interested in what other countries do, as it becomes economically more and more integrated into the world, it starts to matter what happens in other countries. You just can't pretend, if you're China, that you don't care what happens in countries that supply key minerals for your industry. And you can't pretend to care if America starts to, gain influence there. So I think China is one of those places you watch to see how expansive China's ambitions are. It's a fascinating question, isn't it? So we have the impeachment of Trump coming up on February, I think it's the 6th now. And 17 Republican senators have to cross and vote against him if he's to be convicted. It's not at all clear they will, in spite of the fact that I think for a president to incite, to lie about the results of the election, to incite the mob, and then to sit on his hands for hours while the mob was ransacking Congress, and while people were phoning up, senators and congressmen were phoning up to beg him to say something. That's about as close to an impeachable offence as you can get, I think. And it's astonishing that it will be very hard for Republicans to break with their tribe. It's, to my mind, the question you raise is absolutely the key question in the United States. The party, even now, 70% odd of Republicans think the election was stolen. It's very hard to see how you get large-scale cooperation between Republicans and Democrats when the base of the party feels that the Biden presidency is illegitimate and that Democrats are essentially riggers of elections. On the other hand, the kind of one interesting sign is to watch Mitch McConnell, who was, until the elections in Georgia, the majority leader of the Senate. And McConnell is about as canny an operator as you get in American politics. And he's realized, I think, that Trump's grip on the party is a long-term threat and has started to move against him. And of course, the logic there is really interesting. Once you start to take on Trump, you have to finish the job. Nothing is more dangerous than attacking Trump, just injuring him and for him to come back and wreak his revenge on you. So I think McConnell has made it pretty clear that he's moved against Trump, and that will mean that this isn't over. But this question you raise is absolutely the fundamental question, and I think our futures depend on it. It's not just the future of America. Our futures depend on it because these arguments have bubbled over into foreign policy in a way they never did before. So the key one, I'm not a technology expert, but the key one my colleagues tell me is chip making. And so that's why I highlighted it. It's really important that for America's security, and I would say for the West's security, that China remains a generation or two behind, as it is at the moment. And it's really, really difficult and really, really expensive to get to build these latest fabs. I think TSMC's latest capex was $28 billion for this year, which is an extraordinary amount of money. And China is pouring money into the sector. It's handing out subsidies and grants. And I saw in our coverage last week that 50,000 companies have registered in China as having an interest in the semiconductor industry, which doesn't mean they really do. What it really means is that they think they can get some of their hand on some of this subsidy. So there's going to be a real race there. Then, of course, AI and quantum computing are the other two really big ones, I think, for obvious reasons. Space. Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, under Trump, America created its special branch of space military, and it's become pretty clear, hasn't it, that communications and satellites are a vulnerability. And various countries, Russia and China, have tested space weapons. Britain has good space industry people, mostly with smaller satellites, and is investing, as you know, and it's, I think, rather blew a lot of money. It's an investment in the satellite industry recently with OneWeb. I'm not sure that was the right use of money. Maybe better to use that money doing other things, but that's where we are. So Britain can be nimble. It's got good technology and it can do things, but the real heft here is with the space powers, and it's particularly China and America and Russia. I don't think it is inevitable, but there's no doubt that politics has become, we're in an age where politics is about identity and emotion more than about pragmatism. So the argument, the strong argument against the breakup of the EU, which is that Scotland loses a large share of GDP if money doesn't go north through the reallocation of taxation, that argument is not enough, I don't think, anymore to trump the emotional appeal to independence. And I think that, we happen to live in that sort of an age, and for as long as we do, independence will remain attractive. But I don't think it's inevitable, because the disadvantages to Scotland are really quite significant. But it requires a response from the government in Westminster that's been almost entirely lacking. I mean, Boris Johnson's government seems to have one answer to this problem, which is just to say, well, you had your vote, it's got to wait for a generation. We're not going to have another one, and you have to wait for a few decades. I think that's very hard to sustain over time. It'll sustain it for a while. But ultimately, the sort of thing Brown has talked about, of having a further settlement between the nations, may be what's required. And the other thing I think that's required for the Union to remain together is some sort of narrative. I mean, you can't just sell the Union on having a few extra pounds in your pocket anymore. That logic that's not the kind of age we're in. You need to explain how, I believe anyway, how people can have all these nested identities. You can be Scottish and British and European, and those two things don't have to contradict each other. In fact, they can reinforce each other. As to the consequences if it happens, well, militarily, as I said, it'll be really challenging, because the nuclear fleet and also the sighting of planes, interceptor planes, is very well suited to Scotland. Britain's only naval gunnery base is gunnery target ranges in Scotland. So all of that's a really big problem. And then I think there's the blow to British prestige. Coming after Brexit, I think it would do Britain real harm. And of course, once you get Scotland going, then I suspect Ireland is only a matter of time. I think that's a really good question. I have 4 children, and the 2 youngest children are 18 and 21. And, they're just in university at the moment. And I look at their prospects, and I think it's really tough. I think that young people have had kind of one thing after another coming at them. How does that resolve itself? Well, policy ought to have a role. I'm not sure it will, because young people don't vote enough. Old people vote. And we, like most people, we vote in our own interests. But I think it's a really good question. I wish I had an answer, a prediction as to how it will change things. But I think that sense of injustice will grow. And people, students are lumbered with very heavy debts for pretty second-rate teaching and a jobs market that doesn't get them very far. I see that becoming a real problem. So I think you're exactly right to think about it. I'd like to believe there'll be some sort of settlement and some sort of shift back towards young people, for instance, in pension settlements and things like that. But I don't really have confidence that the democratic system is going to be very good at producing that for as long as voting patterns remain as they are. Yes, that's a really good question as well. And China, I think, is absolutely at the top of that list. The question of whether China grows old before it grows old before it grows rich is kind of the old question. Well, it's grown a lot richer than perhaps we thought it would, but it's still, in GDP per head terms, a middle income country, or rather, it's several countries: a very rich country on the coast and really quite a poor country in some of the rural areas. So the really interesting question is China, and whether China's attitudes change as it grows older. And then the other interesting example are the young continents, Africa and the Middle East, which are still very badly governed, and where we know one of the things that determines political instability is young people, particularly young men, who are unhappy and underemployed. And so I think the potential for kind of revolution and disturbance is focused in those countries with very young populations. And the potential for revolution and upheaval of that kind of disorderly kind, I think, is diminished in populations as they grow older, which means that it's just one of many reasons, I think, for those who believe that, and I may live to regret this prediction as well, but one of the many reasons for thinking that the Chinese model of state-directed capitalism under a very controlling party, which has a sort of technologically enabled autocracy, I think that model has a lot of mileage in it. And we shouldn't sort of expect, it may crack up, but we shouldn't expect it to crack up. I think one of the reasons for thinking that is this demographic calculation. Yeah, it's also a really good question. I mean, I think the world's on a sort of tightrope. We saw the consequences of austerity applied too early after the financial crisis. And part of the sense of unfairness that led to Brexit, I was talking about earlier, part of that came from a tightening that happened too soon and by too great a degree. At the same time, eventually, governments will have to start balancing budgets. And finding a path between those two kind of traps is going to be the really difficult job of Western governments over the next decade or so. I don't expect there to be tightening this year. I suspect it will come later on in the decade. And there'll be always going to have to be these course corrections between over-tightening and letting the debt build up. The hope is that you get sufficient economic growth with possibly a little bit of inflation, wouldn't be a bad thing, so that nominal growth is reasonable, which means that as long as that keeps the debt shrinking as a share of GDP, you're kind of moving in the right direction. But countries like Italy, particularly, which don't have their own currency, that have not seen productivity growth, that have not seen much economic growth since then it entered the euro, you really kind of worry about them in the medium term. Britain, because it has its own currency, is in a better position. I mean, we might well end up poorer, but in terms of there being runs and sort of cracks, I think Britain's got some advantages there. But it's going to be very tricky. Of course, a preliminary, let's just say I'll finish with one thing, which is one of the interesting things is Biden's enormous 1.29 trillion spending plan that he's introduced. If anything, to me, that seems sort of too big at the moment, and it might end up running the economy really, really hot. And that'll be an interesting thing, because if American interest rates start to rise, then you'll feel the squeeze everywhere around the world, and that could have, really, really created a lot of tension between the US and other countries that in one way or another are affected by dollar rates.
Ed, that was amazing delivery, great breadth and absolute clarity. And given the range of questions that you fielded, I thought that was an outstanding job. So thank you very much for that.
That's a great pleasure.